Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to talk about a very important topic, and that is the weakness of the back rank. And also, I'd like to talk about the importance of attention to detail in chess, and of course in life. Let's get to our first example in this lesson. Here we go. In this position, it is White's turn. Black has just moved his rook from f8 to c8, attacking the white queen. Well, our normal reaction when we're being attacked is to run away. Or of course, at times it may be to block or capture the attacker. But if we're not keeping in mind the important detail of the fact that Black has a back rank weakness, which typically can be seen by the fact that the 3 pawns in front of a castled king are not yet moved, and therefore the Black king in this case cannot move upward towards the 7th rank, and obviously cannot move down because there is no 9th rank. So all White would need to do is move down to the 8th rank a linear piece like a rook or a queen, and unless that piece would be captured, it could be checkmate. But if White would try to do that right away, obviously the black rook would capture on e8. So what White needs to do in this case, White needs to get rid of the defender of the e8 square, whatever the cost is, even if it means we need to give up on our own queen. And that's exactly what White needs to do right now. Simply capture the rook, in fact giving a check. Black has only one legal move, capturing the queen, and here we go, White is ready to checkmate. So this is the theme of our lesson today, the back rank weakness. Now it's important to understand that the pattern, the motive that we're referring to is a situation when on one hand the edge, the limitation of the chessboard restricts the king from the escape, and on the other hand, going in the other direction, his own pieces, typically 2 or 3 of his own pawns. Now, this may happen also on the side of the board, that is, on the A or H files, not just on the 8th or the 1st rank. Let me show you an example of that. Here we go. In this position, it is Black's turn for a change, and White at the moment has an extra knight. So if Black does not play forcefully and misses his opportunity to win, it will be gone forever, and White will be clearly ahead. An attacking move such as rook to h6, while it certainly threatens to checkmate by queen takes knight on the next move, would not be a great idea because it would give White the opportunity to give, for example, endless checks with the queen, as the black king is pretty naked with no pawns or pieces around it. Moreover, White could also simply retreat the queen to d2, protecting the knight. And again, White's material advantage would be very significant. Therefore, looking at this position, it's important to recognize the situation that the white king is in. The white king has no moves at the moment, and because White has the rook on g1, that king will not be able to move in towards the g file. And just like we talked about the imaginary 9th rank, which does not exist, and therefore the black king could not escape there in our previous example, in this case, next to the H file, there is no file I. Therefore, the chessboard is limited. So, after the correct combination, queen takes knight, forcing king takes queen, and rook h6, the white king has no escape because of the above-mentioned problems. Also, it's important to notice that unlike in the previous position, when the king could not escape towards the 7th rank purely because of his own pieces, his own pawns, took away those opportunities. In this case, black has an assistant in the pawn on f3, which guards the important g2 square. White here can only delay the end by blocking the check with the queen, but of course that does not change the end result, just drags the game a move longer. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this position, there is material balance as of the piece is concerned. On the other hand, on the pawn count, black is 1 pawn ahead. Black has just moved his rook to g8, offering the exchange of rooks. If white does not find the correct move here, black will be clearly better with having excellent moves coming up in the check with the rook on c1 or pinning the white rook on g2 with bishop to d5. Therefore, white must be very careful. And this is a wonderful example of the fact that just because you're in an inferior position, or at least inferior looking position, it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily be purely on the defensive. Always, always look out for your opportunities, even if they seem unlikely. In this case, we can see that the black king again is next to the edge of the board, both on the 8th rank and as well being on the A file. However, the 8th rank is pretty well protected at the moment on the black side. Black has both rooks there, and importantly, the rook on g8 is protected by the bishop. However, on the A file, on the other hand, black is missing the important pawn that would keep the black king safe. It's not hard to imagine that if one of the white rooks could get to the A file indeed without being captured, that could cause serious trouble for the black king. However, at this very moment, either of the white rooks moving to the A file could be captured by black's bishop on b3. And here it's an important motive when again we are removing the guard. Even though the bishop seems to guard both the A2 and A4 squares, if white succeeds to give up one rook and yet after that get the other rook also to the A file, that can result in checkmate. So here the correct sequence is to play rook A2 check. When bishop captures, then rook A4 and checkmate. It's important to point out that if white would switch around the order and would play rook A4 first, that would not be the same, because now after rook A2, the black king is not in check, and black would get sufficient time to protect the bishop, for example, by playing b7 to b5. And black would be a rook ahead. But black has an even better option to checkmate himself immediately, in fact, with a back rank checkmate. So therefore, the order of moves is rather significant. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, black greedily just captured a pawn on e4 with his rook. Looks like a good move capturing a pawn, and in addition, immediately attacking white's queen on h4. It seems that black is completely safe as the knight on c6 covers both key squares on the back rank b8 and d8. This is a good example why it's so important to always watch out for your back rank. There are several ways to make sure that there is never gonna be trouble there. The most common way to solve this issue is to simply, at some point, I guess earlier in the game than where we're at right now, play h7 to h6, and that would clear the h7 square for the black king and therewith solve all kind of problems. The other possibility is to make sure you keep a rook at all times on the 8th rank. Although that has a bit of danger because that would mean that when a rook is on the 8th rank, even though it controls squares on the file that it's on, nevertheless, that rook would be somewhat tied down, just like here. Even though the rook was attacking that pawn on e4, which was just captured, but in reality, the rook was needed on the 8th rank and needs to stay there. So therefore, the best solution is, as you can see, the h7 pawn moving up. Well, in this case, it's too late. Black already made the mistake and allowed white's winning combination, which is a very similar pattern to what we saw in the last example, namely that the knight on a c6 is overworked. By protecting both the b8 and d8 squares, white can first pull one hand of the knight towards the b file to b8, and then when the knight is gone from there, then the queen is ready to come to d8, attacking the black king, and black can only delay the end by blocking the check with the rook, which naturally will be captured and game over. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position, black has an extra pawn, and things would look pretty good with the advanced passed pawn on c4 if black would have the little window open, for example, the h7 pawn being on h6, but it's not. Also, you may notice the pin that is existing over the rook on c6. You may think, wouldn't it be a good idea to play rook b6 and try to use the pin as if now rook captures rook, then the white queen would capture the black queen with checkmate. However, in reality, this would be a serious blunder. Why? Because black can get out of the pin by making an intermediate move, check, and even though the white king has an escape, it will mean that then the black rook will capture the white rook, and now the a8 square is guarded by black's queen from a1, and therefore black simply has won a rook. Not a good deal for white. Going back to the starting position, white can win material. White cannot immediately force checkmate, but because of the back rank weakness that black has, white is able to capture the rook on c6. And this is a very typical pattern to take advantage of the weakness of the back rank. Of course, if now queen takes queen, black gets lost immediately after rook to b8. Let's see our next example. Here we go. In this position, there is a balance as of material concerned, and black thought he can change that by capturing the pawn on c4. At first, it looks like a normal move, as the rook on e8 is protected by black's knight on f6. However, the problem is that after that exchange on e8 and the knight recapturing, white indeed can come down to f8. While this is not a checkmate, it certainly wins the knight on e8. Going back to the starting position, black should have done a move that prevents this problem. For example, trade first the pawns and then move the king closer to the action to avoid the problem that we saw in the other variation, where the bishop immediately captured the pawn. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. And this is a very interesting example, and we'll see several very similar positions now in a row. Right now, white has an extra bishop, but black has the opportunity to capture it right away. And the question is, can really black capture that bishop, or is it a trap? Well, if queen captures on e3, white has a very typical checkmate in 3. And that starts with check, king b8, and then rook d8. Even though rook can take, it doesn't end well for black after rook takes rook. Here is another position that looks rather similar to the last one. The question is, can white here capture this pawn on e3 and reach similar ideas as in the previous example? And this is where paying attention to detail is so important, because really there is very minor difference, however minor and yet very different, and yet very important. The big difference is that the black pawn is not on a7, but it is on a6. And why it matters is because after queen takes bishop, queen check, king b8, queen d8 would be a real blunder, as after rook takes, the black king simply escapes. So therefore, this combination does not work right now, and white's best alternative option is to retreat the bishop to e1 and yet still keep the material advantage. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position, white has 2 extra rooks and the pawn versus black's 3 minor pieces. So white has some material advantage. Right now, the white rook is hanging in the corner, and the rook should simply move away. But the question is where to? The best square to move to is to h4, to attack black's weak pawn on g4. However, white noticed an attractive alternative, namely a combination based on black's back rank weakness. As we learned from some of the previous examples, a typical idea is to deflect the defender of a key square. In this example, the knight on f7 is a key defender because it guards the important back rank square d8. If that knight wouldn't be where it is, the white rook could move down to d8 and checkmate. However, the knight it is where it is and guards that square. So white's idea was to try to pull the knight's hand in another direction by checking on h8, and indeed, if now knight takes rook, checkmate arrives with rook d8. However, the big problem is that after rook h8, also the black bishop can capture, and in that case, the rook h8 check would have been a big blunder. I can't stress it enough times how important it is to always to pay attention to your opponent's best options and moves, not just your own. Let's see the next example, where it is white's turn. And in this position, white is a bishop down. However, black's back rank is weak. And this is a perfect example when you have to be looking out for your opponent's best response. Otherwise, you may make a big mistake, like white did in this game. By moving the queen to d8, white actually blundered the queen, because after rook takes, black is not in checkmate, as black can safely block that check with the bishop. So therefore, this is a big mistake for white. On the other hand, white missed a good opportunity to equalize the material balance by trading queens, followed by capturing the black bishop. Let's move on to a similar example. Here we go. In this case, the black queen also guards the d8 square in addition to black's rook. White has some material advantage already and could increase it by creating a fork with queen d4, attacking the rook as well as the g4 pawn a second time. However, white thought that using black's back rank weakness, they can win a pawn immediately by capturing on g4. Would this be a good idea? It certainly seems so, but not really, because after queen takes bishop, queen d8 check, black will not capture the queen immediately, but play queen c8 and be completely safe and the pawn up. So therefore, the bishop sacrifice in this example would be a serious mistake. And here is our final example for this lesson. Here we go. In this position, again, it seems that white can immediately win by playing queen d8. But this only seems so. It's not the reality. After queen d8, black captures the queen, and now it's too late for white to notice that the rook is pinned and cannot therefore capture on d8. Of course, white had no obligation to play queen d8, and it's much better to initiate the exchange of queens with queen d4, considering white's material advantage. What's the moral of this lesson? Well, always look out for opportunities relating to the back rank checkmate. And make sure you will not get checkmated on your own back rank. Thank you for listening. So long until next week.